So far, we have done quite extensive travel in the United States, and we are going to be going to Mexico and Central United States. The committee will be going next week. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome our three new committee members. Welcome. As we brag, we're one of the most exciting, active, efficient, get-her-done committees on the Hill, so you'll see how that works. But we're here for Canadians, to work with Canadians and to help have more trade and help our economy grow. But without further ado, I am going to start off, and we have witnesses with us. As you know, the witnesses probably had a heads up. You get a 5-minute start up to explain your side or your case, and then we go to the MPs for dialogue with MPs. So I think we're going to start right off the bat, and we're going to go with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business and Max Skurdra. Go ahead, Max, you got the floor.
Thank you. So 5 minutes, and then questions after that?
No, everybody does 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up. Okay?
Excellent. Thank you for having me. Condolences on the loss of the parliamentarian. I will cut right to it. I represent the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. We have a membership of over 500 companies. 70% of those are Aboriginal firms, so we are the largest business organization in Canada. We have been doing public policy research as well as corporate social responsibility and events and networking for Aboriginal companies. The mission is to effectively connect corporate Canada with Aboriginal firms. We have the 30% of our members that aren't Aboriginal are some of the largest corporate players in Canada, including Suncor, Syncrude, IBM, Tim Hortons, et cetera. So we kind of bridge the gap between Indigenous business and the Indigenous economy and mainstream corporate Canada. As I said, we do quite a bit of public policy research. Our findings in partnership with Environics Research Group as well as TD Economics have demonstrated that the Aboriginal economy in Canada is booming, as it were. It is growing at a remarkable pace. There are roughly 43,000 Aboriginal companies in Canada. Those companies have increased in the last 5 years. The profitability of those companies has increased by 15%, as well as the profits of those companies. The number of profitable companies, as well as the profitability, has increased markedly. The research we did with TD Economics demonstrates that Aboriginal companies do more business abroad than the Canadian average, and that they introduce new services, processes, or products to their firms than the Canadian average. So based on that, we would say that they innovate more than the Canadian average. This significant growth, I think, is something that is overlooked in most of the Canadian discourse, and I would say it's a significant bright spot in the relationship between Indigenous Canadians and then the broader society. We have been working for the last 30 years at CCAB to support and facilitate that growth. And I guess what I would like to ask or put forward to the committee is the importance of a number of very key things in the NAFTA renegotiations and as well in the broader policy context. We are quite concerned, obviously, due to the dependence and the predominance of Aboriginal companies that do business abroad and in the United States in particular, at anything to restrict that flow of trade across the border, as well as anything that would restrict freedom of movement for Indigenous peoples and businesses. In particular, currently set-asides for NAFTA. So I guess that's the defensive position. The more offensive position that we see is that the current reservations and in NAFTA allow for set-asides from the Canadian government to support Aboriginal businesses. We would like to see that language expanded somewhat to be more reflective of what's in CETA, which would give the federal government a broader scope of action to support Aboriginal businesses. What you see in Canada right now is firms like Suncor or Bruce Power doing considerable work to support Aboriginal businesses through procurement processes. Companies like TransAlta doing really, really innovative work to help with financing. And the government of Canada federally is somewhat tied by trade policy. So we would like to see that changed with the updated NAFTA. We would also really like to put out there, as I'm sure some of my colleagues will as well, that there is a concern around intellectual property. And we would be quite concerned at anything that sort of negotiates away parts of Indigenous intellectual property that the government maybe isn't on the top of the agenda or the first thing that comes to mind when discussing that issue with the United States. How am I doing for time? I usually don't do this in 5 minutes.
Well, you only got a half a minute, but it's all right. We like it when you finished early. No, but you know what? There's lots of time when you're getting question and answers to interject. You might have new thoughts, so we're not that strict here. So.
Well, I can keep talking. I mean,
No, we'll move on, and you'll have lots of room to speak as we go along. But thank you
I
for
appreciate
your
it.
comments. And we're going to move on now to the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization, and we have Wayne Garneau Williams, who is the chair. Go ahead, sir. You got the floor.
Good afternoon. Bonjour. Tanse. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional territory of the Algonquin peoples. I'm chair of what we call IDEO. My core recommendation for you today as legislators is to enable enabling legislation for international intertribal trade. IDEO's raison d'etre is to assist in the global flow and exchange of Indigenous goods, services, and investments while respecting its principles, which are respect for Indigenous culture and teachings, establishing environmentally sustainable practices, informing, educating, and encouraging all parties to adopt these practices, fostering Indigenous communities that are healthy, robust, and stable, and above all, grow Indigenous economies. Canada, the United States, and Mexico are countries founded on trade with their original Indigenous peoples. The 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples Comprehensive Review issued priorities which include, and I quote, "A vision of a renewed relationship is based on these priorities, the economy, lands and resources, and economic development," unquote. Canada's legal obligations to Indigenous peoples are basically duty to consult and accommodate under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, and various comprehensive land claim settlements, which include an express treaty obligation to consult Indigenous parties if their interests may be affected by new international treaties that Canada is negotiating. In short, meaningful, full, and informed consultation is key. Canada, Mexico, and the United States are all signatories to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which celebrated its 10th anniversary just last week. Article 19, to paraphrase it, is that the countries shall consult with Indigenous peoples to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent on issues that may affect Indigenous peoples. This is consistent with the Government of Canada's July 2017 statement, the 10 Federal Indigenous Relationship Principles. I focus only on Principle 6 and 8. Principle 6 is basically the free, prior, informed consent. Principle 8 is renewed fiscal relationship developed in collaboration with Indigenous nations that promote a mutually supportive climate for economic partnership and resource development. In previous NAFTA, as my friend was saying, Canada, Mexico, and the United States each inserted specific non-conforming measures that exempt specific sectors from the operation of NAFTA. Aboriginal Affairs sector is one of them. A NAFTA Indigenous chapter could include topics like traditional knowledge, not to be confused with intellectual property, intertribal trade, Indigenous free passage rights, i.e. the Jay Treaty border crossing principles, market access, agriculture, rules of origin, dispute settlement, sustainable development, intertribal international investment, procurement, financing, labor, and HR. Again, we ask parliamentarians to pass enabling legislation for international intertribal trade. And in conclusion, I'd like to close with the following words of Justice Murray Sinclair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In his 2015 final report, he states, and quote, "Reconciliation calls for national action. Laws must be changed. Policies and programs must be changed. The way we do business must change. Members of the Standing Committee on Trade, reconciliation includes federal government recognition of pre-existing Indigenous economic rights through enabling legislation for international intertribal trade." Those are my comments, and I open it for questions.
Well, thank you, sir. And we're going to move on to the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board, and we have Don Madabi Leach, the interim chair. Go ahead. Thank you. You got the floor.
Thank you. Miigwech. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and I speak to you as interim chair of the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board. Our board is made up of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis business and community leaders from across Canada, whose mandate is to advise the whole of the federal government on Indigenous economic development. As you know, the Government of Canada now supports the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples without qualification. As the Declaration celebrates its 10th anniversary, the board welcomes and congratulates the Government of Canada for taking this important step towards true reconciliation with Indigenous people. We urge the Government of Canada to take a bold and decisive leadership role in ensuring that a modernized NAFTA integrates Indigenous rights and considerations into the very fabric of the agreement. Not only is this in keeping with Canada's stated commitment to a renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples in Canada, but it is also consistent with Canada's commitment to promoting human rights, inclusion, and respect for diversity around the world. During the first NAFTA negotiations in 1994, Indigenous peoples in North America expressed different opinions. While some Indigenous peoples felt that trade liberalization would create economic opportunities, many felt that NAFTA would not benefit Indigenous people as a whole. Many of the concerns stemmed from the fact that NAFTA was negotiated without proper consultation and participation of Indigenous peoples. Our board strongly believes that the success of this renewed agreement for Indigenous peoples in Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. will hinge upon the process by which the agreement is negotiated and meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples. This is the base requirement upon which the specifics of the terms and conditions of the agreement must be built. Traditionally, our people had free and open borders. Trade between nations that today fall on both sides of the U.S. and Canadian borders was unencumbered, and there are numerous examples today of communities whose traditional territories exist on both sides of the border. The Jay Treaty of 1794 between the U.S. and Britain sets a precedent for the recognition of traditional Indigenous practices and systems of trade, commerce, and mobility that existed long before European arrival to North America. The Jay Treaty recognizes and confirms our pre-existing rights, rights that are constitutionally protected. For Canada, it is in this context of rights that a modernized NAFTA must be negotiated. In Mexico since 1994, Indigenous communities in Mexico have faced human rights violations under the agreement through the loss of lands and livelihoods. Our board stands in solidarity with all Indigenous communities across North America and urges the Government of Canada to lead in rectifying the issues that led to the violation of Indigenous rights under NAFTA. An Indigenous chapter is of critical importance to ensure that Indigenous rights are inherent in the agreement. Our board's report, called Reconciliation: Growing Canada's Economy by $27.7 billion, estimates that Canada's GDP would grow by 1.5% or $27.7 billion per year if barriers preventing Indigenous Canadians from participating on equal footing in the Canadian economy were removed. In Canada, Supreme Court cases such as Chilcotin and versus BC have recognized Aboriginal title to lands and resources, giving the First Nation exclusive rights to the use of this land. Across Canada, Indigenous ownership and control over large tracts of land which encompass significant natural resources is a reality that will likely grow, increasing Indigenous land ownership and creating opportunities for international trade. Much of northern Canada, for example, is governed by modern land claim and self-government agreements. These constitutionally protected agreements provide Indigenous peoples in the north ownership of large tracts of land, as well as harvesting rights, capital transfers, and participation in land and water management regimes. Canada's north covers 40% of the country's land mass and is almost exclusively covered by land claim agreements. The forestry sector, one of Canada's biggest trade industries, worth $22 billion annually, involves many Indigenous communities and businesses. Across Canada, 58% of Indigenous communities have a contract or a partnership with a forest company. This creates immense opportunities for both Indigenous communities and private natural resource companies to respond with innovative solutions domestically as well as across borders. Besides forestry, Indigenous businesses are directly involved in primary resource-related industries, including fisheries and mineral development. Through meaningful inclusion in NAFTA, Indigenous peoples in Canada have a unique opportunity to grow our economy by harnessing the energy and expertise of Indigenous communities across Canada. An area of concern for our board in the current round of NAFTA renegotiations is procurement. Subnational procurement in Canada is worth an estimated $18 billion annually, and it is a significant contributor to Indigenous economic development.
Excuse me, just if you don't mind wrapping it up a bit. 'cause
Okay.
we're way over time, so.
I just wanted to also say that the board encourages the Government of Canada to negotiate strongly for exemptions from the Buy America requirements and to enhance Canadian and business access to procurement opportunities in the U.S. Indigenous minority suppliers in the U.S. are already provided with procurement opportunities that are substantial and measurable, and so should we. So, in closing, I just want to say first that Indigenous peoples and Indigenous corporations' access to economic opportunities must be protected, and economic development must be meaningfully supported through the inclusion of an Indigenous chapter in the agreement. And that the federal government has committed to full implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, including actions number 44 and 43, which call for full adoption and implementation of the UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People. So I would welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. And we're going to start off with, we're going to get into dialogue with the MPs, and then we're starting off with the Conservatives. They have the first 5 minutes, and Mr. Carey, you got the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. This is such an important treaty, and I'm going to try not to talk very much. It's extremely hard for politicians, but we only have 5 minutes. You mentioned the Jay Treaty, and really when you think of it, Indigenous people were the first free traders. And I'd like to know, to what extent have Indigenous people participated in the Government of Canada's consultation process? And on balance, do you think your views have been heard and considered?
I know that the Jay Treaty discussion has been pretty extensive because it's been very much a gray area here in Canada, where we do have some borders where it's pretty open for trade, especially amongst Indigenous people across the borders, and it has not been an issue. We've had our people in our area selling fish to the U.S., for example, and that's not, but in some areas that wouldn't be allowed. It always depends on the border crossing. So I really think that we need to clear up the area of the it's not consistent, and I think that looking at the spirit of the Jay Treaty and the fact that we do have communities right on the border with people living in the same community, same chief and council, but different locations of homes on some bordering, well, of course, the U.S. and Canadian borders, and that's just how our people hunted in those areas. So this really is an area that I think there ought to be more discussion to come to some sort of an agreement so that all parties, especially under the NAFTA discussions, clarifies how this would be, what the process would be.
Do you have any specific recommendations for us to bring forward?
Well, I think that the spirit of the Jay Treaty should be recognized. I think that if there's companies that are identified as Indigenous and verified by their communities as Indigenous, then they should be allowed to have that trade across the border, and there could be a registry system for the companies that are allowed to trade. I think that that's one.
I think Mr. Garman-Williams wanted to
Yes,
something?
thank you. My friend here is right in the sense that it's the spirit of the Jay Treaty, because as we all know, the Jay Treaty has no force or effect in Canada currently as a result of both the judicial decision saying Great Britain was a signatory, not Canada, and we've never passed enabling legislation to that effect. So there's that, but it's the principle behind it. And when you roll back the clock and you look at the fact that back in 1794, when Great Britain in what we know Canada and the United States were establishing a border, they realized, you know, we've got a whole bunch of Indigenous people, and they're trading all over the place. We've got, for example, the Mohawk in what we now know as Ontario, Quebec, and New York. We've got the Athabasca, which is in Alaska and Yukon. We've got the Coast Salish in BC and Washington. We've got the Colville Federated Tribe and Okanagan in Washington and BC, respectively. I could go all the way across the border and find First Nations that have been cut in two. Some of them are vehemently trying to reestablish their links, but it's very hard because, of course, back then, when you roll back the time and you see the fact that the federal perspective on Indigenous people back then was very, you're not citizens, you're not necessarily even people, and through manifest destiny, we're taking over. So it's this new field that we're looking at to revisit the past. We can't move forward without acknowledging that what happened with respect to Great Britain and the United States was to acknowledge the pre-existing right, an economic right of trade, Indigenous intertribal trade, that was embodied through the Jay Treaty. I'll just quote the Jay Treaty if I could, just a very short little section. Indians dwelling on either side of the said boundary line freely to pass and repass by land or inland navigation into respective territories and countries of the two parties on the continent of America, and to navigate all lakes, rivers, and waters thereof, and freely to carry on trade and commerce with each other. That is what it's all about. And to respect that is part of reconciliation if Canada wants to put their money where their mouth is. And that's why I'm saying pass legislation like what's happened in the United States with respect to the Jay Treaty. I mentioned the fact that the Jay Treaty was revoked because of the War of 1812. And then as a result of a stalemate, the United States said, hey, why don't we pass legislation to support the principles of the Jay Treaty, which they did. Section 289 of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, as amended in 1965, have embodied the spirit of the Jay Treaty in the United States. So it's not hard to imagine Canada could pass legislation enabling intertribal trade between the nations and just clear that up, because the moment you do, then all the other departments have to get in line. Customs, excise, Port Authority, all of those organizations have to say, okay, great, Parliament wants this, we're going to make this happen. Without that, you can see it, the history of this, trying to move Indigenous trade, getting hamstrung by the departments.
Thank you, sir. We're way over time, but it was such a good dialogue. I let it keep going, but no, we're over time, and we're going to move over to the Liberals now. And Mr. Fonseca, you get the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your presentations. And as I was listening intently, Mr. Scudder, you spoke to many of the successes that the Indigenous peoples have had in terms of business success, in terms of trade. It's fabulous to hear that. And I think through the consultations that we've heard, and we've received as a government, over 22,000 submissions have come in. And I'm sure through many of those submissions and many of the conversations that have been had with Indigenous peoples, the minister and our government proudly put forward to have as a priority of ours an Indigenous chapter within NAFTA, and we think this is terrific. Now, we're going to push forward with our table, with our trade negotiators. They're being informed by many of these discussions, many of these conversations at the table. If that chapter does not make it into that final agreement of NAFTA, my question is, what other options would you like Canada to pursue with our other two trading partners?
Well, I think that the first thing and the minimum thing is the exceptions that Wayne and I and we were discussing. I think that the expanding the scope of federal action, especially around procurements of Aboriginal companies, beyond just set-asides to more proactive initiatives, I think would be a sort of a mandatory minimum we would like to see. I think that would be very, very important, as well as protecting other kind of, I would say, key interests around intellectual property, around traditional knowledge, the protection of traditional knowledge in particular. I think those would be other high priorities from CCAB's perspective.
Okay. Mr. Williams, yeah.
Enabling legislation for international intertribal trade, basically making right past wrongs concerning the principles underlying the pre-existing economic right of intertribal trade.
And we have, I work every day financing Indigenous businesses, and we do have businesses that are, those businesses that are doing trade in the U.S. already. It is easy for them to do trade in the U.S. more so than for companies to come to Canada. So this enabling legislation would be most helpful, and recognizing that intellectual property as well, or that, you know, we need to have those kinds of things. And the meaningful procurement, our procurement system that we have here is not measurable. There's nobody making sure that that it's actually happening, and that there's a report done to provide to the public with the fact that this many Indigenous businesses are actually doing that. Nobody's auditing that to say if there's no audit of it. And I think that we need to do that to show that there are actually Indigenous businesses benefiting from what this government's contracting out.
If I could just second that again, what you see in the private sector are points on scorecards. You're seeing a really progressive work to drill down supply chains. So if Bruce Power puts out a $250 million nuclear refurbishment procurement, there's no Aboriginal company that can do it. They're very good about making sure that it gets down their supply chains to the level that Aboriginal companies can begin to feed into the system. They measure it. They can produce reports on it. We would really like to see, to Don's point, the federal government start to do more to give teeth to their procurement projects, initiatives and policies, as well as to measure the outcomes of those policies. I think that there's some great stuff in place, just not being measured.
And to support Max's concept, intellectual property must not be confused with traditional knowledge. And right now, we have no legislation protecting traditional knowledge, and it's being fuzzified with intellectual property. A quick little synopsis of what the difference. Traditional knowledge, well, intellectual property, as you know, protects an individual or an entity for a specific period of time for a product they've developed. So the sweat equity and all the capital that went into that, they get a chance to make their money back. So there's a specific individual or organization for a specific period of time for a specific product. In comparison, with respect to traditional knowledge, there is no specific person. It started from time immemorial, and there is no end. It goes on for perpetuity, and it's owned collectively by the nation. So I use the example of the Cowichan sweater. There have been various attempts to copy the Cowichan sweater through various companies internationally, but where the capacity for the Cowichan people to protect their property right in that traditional knowledge, because it's not just the sweater, it's not just the design, it's the stories behind it, it's the lore and the legends that go with each of those patterns. So it means a lot to Indigenous people, traditional knowledge.
Thank you, sir.
Finally, I just wanted to say one quick thing on this is that, you know, I know it's going to be difficult to get this chapter into the NAFTA agreement, but at least I think there needs to be some kind of an acknowledgement about UNDRIP. And I think about Indigenous people, you might not have a full, complete chapter, but I think it's so important that we have something in there that acknowledges this as it's a global acceptance, and I think it's so important that Canada push forward with that as a commitment that Canada has been making to Indigenous people here.
Thank you, and we're going to move over to the NDP now. Madam Ramsey, you got the floor for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of you. That's actually an excellent segue into, what I really did want to ask you. The work of my colleague Romeo Saganash and his PMB would ensure the laws of Canada actively respect the government's obligation to obtain free, prior, and informed consent and respect the human rights of Indigenous people. In your opinion, would adopting Mr. Saganash's bill help to further respect international obligations with respect to Indigenous people?
Absolutely. He's an individual who's worked so hard on this. He has a complete understanding of all of the issues internationally on this, and I'm so happy that Canada has finally stepped up to to endorse this, and I think it's so key for us to go forward, and this has to be part of everything that we do as in any kind of Canadian law going forward. I think it's so critical, and it makes sense. When you read that declaration, everything in there is so important, and going forward, having that type of support or reference, at least in an international document like this, is going to be really key to going forward. And I think that's the kind of role that Canada can play in the world today.
My question as a follow-up is to you, Mr. Williams, and how would that help the implementation of UNDRIP and the full adoption of Canada? How would it help to protect intellectual property rights and the traditional knowledge that you spoke of?
Thank you. The problem with UNDRIP is the fact that it's only a declaration, and as you all know, declarations are non-binding, so that it's the goodwill of each of the signatories to follow the declaration or choose not to, and how they implement it or how they choose not to implement it is discretionary. So there's an argument out there that UNDRIP may be in the field now because of it's things that are taken for granted as being considered customary international law. And so if it's customary international law and determined so by an international court or a domestic court, then it's enforceable. If it's just declaratory, then it's discretionary. So to answer your question with respect to traditional knowledge, again, it's a matter of putting teeth in the bill in the sense that make it real, don't make it discretionary.
It's enforceable. So my colleague asked about, what if we're unable to get a chapter? But my question is, first of all, do you feel that Indigenous people are at the table as an equal partner in this negotiation? And out of this chapter, where do you see opportunities, and what would you like to see inside the chapter? I'm always an optimist, so let's assume we have the chapter, and then also the question of whether you feel you're there as an equal partner.
Why not? So I think that what we'd like to see within the chapter is more of what we've been talking about a little bit already. I think that some of the really, really key things that we would like to see are very proactive tools around procurement and improving procurement in the public process. What we'd love to see is, what we need to see is to ensure that First Nations communities will often create economic development corporations. They're First Nations Inuit or Métis companies that represent their community. We need to make sure that those are protected from any SOE terms in NAFTA. We'd like to make sure that there's as great freedom of movement of people and businesses for Aboriginal companies as possible, and we'd like to see, I guess, a recognition of the environment for Aboriginal peoples in Canada today, and an increased ability for that inter-community trade.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that we're there as equal partners today, and I think that that can be improved, and I can tell you that there's many capable Indigenous people who can help write that chapter. We could put the specifics together. You put a group of people, and I could think of a group of people right now from across the country who would do a great job in putting together the chapter for you with all the details that are needed on I've read all of the input that's been provided by Indigenous people today, and I know that there's some great solutions and ideas that we could put forward and work on that.
From my perspective, I see intertribal trade as something that must be protected and enhanced. I see a system where ideally a NAFTA chapter would have an intertribal trade option or a structure that allows for example, American Indians and Canadian First Nations or Métis or Inuit to negotiate something amongst themselves that's protected and enshrined, so that there's full economic sovereignty of the tribes to be able to negotiate their own trade apparatus by using the NAFTA Aboriginal chapter as a mechanism in which to negotiate something that's a win-win for them.
Just to get to your first question, I think that what you've seen is with this round of NAFTA negotiations is a really impressive crack at engaging Indigenous peoples. I think that the national chief being so involved, I know the civil service as well as this, I think are great. It's a great starting point, and I think it's really, really well some great, I hope, results. So we don't know yet, but we'll see. But we're very optimistic. I am, at least. I think what's complicated is the specificity of the discussion. So Wayne is a lawyer with a lot of experience in the civil service, so he's uniquely capable of commenting. But I think that what we'd like to see is more of what's more. We'd like to see more opportunities, and as well more resources around putting these conversations together, to Don's point, because I think it's a very complicated technical subject to provide input on, and I think that there's many qualified people who could do it. But to create the formats, the venues, the vehicles for Indigenous people to be able to work together to provide that input is something that we would really like to see.
There is a core...
We're going way over, but the dialogue's so good. You want to...
There's a core matter of concern with respect to this, and that is, I mean, granted, Global Affairs has been doing a great job of doing consultation with stakeholder groups and with rights holder groups as best they can, but there's a problem with the rights holder groups obligation, the federal obligation, and that is when we go back to the principles of what consultation is all about, and we don't have to go far, then read the Supreme Court of Canada cases of Delgamuukw and Chilcotin to understand what is consultation and what is not. Now, I know we have tight timelines where there's 11 days in between each round, but 11 days in between each round does not provide, from my opinion, as full, frank, fair, meaningful consultation with rights holders. It's fraught with danger that way, because what happens when you end up negotiating something and thinking you've done your consultation, but there's problems all the way with rights holders saying, wait, we don't have enough time to review this. This is too complicated. We have to get people in to review this complicated trade stuff. So my concern here is, and I know there's no control over the timeline, but it's just a fact that 11 days in between rounds is not a lot of time for full and meaningful consultation with the rights holders.
Just, I got a quick question, I guess, and maybe, Wayne, you could answer for me. We've recently, we've been down to Washington, and we met the committee that's similar to ours, the Ways and Means Committee, that's dealing a little different but the same. But if I would have known now, I would have asked them the question, how close is their First Nations people in the United States working with their trade committee and negotiators, or even Mexico? Do they have, you know, their Indigenous people working? Like, we know we are to a certain extent, but so, and we often, as our committee's traveling and hearing our witnesses, there's a lot of farmers from here dealing with farmers downstate, you know, working behind the scenes. So I'm just wondering, you know, I know it might be a long question, but just, are you working with the First Nations people in Mexico and in United States, so they're having input kind of similar to where you are, I guess?
Yeah, I received a note September 14th of this year from the National Congress of American Indians, drafted by their executive director. And in short, the executive director, Jacqueline Pata, says to let you know, myself, that their organization, the National Organization for American Indians, supports the inclusion of an Indigenous chapter in a modernized North American Free Trade Agreement. So they're aware of it, they're supportive of the efforts by Canada to introduce it, and they're lobbying their government, respectively, to get them to be on side. And I also note with respect to I was lucky enough to attend the National Congress of American Indian Economic Development Conference in Washington a week ago, and one of the senior Indian Affairs representatives was speaking. He used to be a law professor, an Indigenous law professor, and he drilled down the Trump administration's perspective on Indigenous rights and the policy. And the phrase that pays, i.e. words make worlds, especially when we're looking at this stuff, with respect to the American policy here, is tribal economic sovereignty is their position. And I think, from an argument standpoint, an Indigenous chapter makes a good fit for that tribal economic sovereignty policy of the U.S. government. So I'm hopeful.
Thank you, and our committee's going to Mexico And I think we're going to be asking them the same questions when we go down there. So we have time for probably one more slot, and I think, Ms. Ludwig, if you want to take up the last 5 minutes, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you very much to the witnesses for your excellent presentations. I'll be fast on my questions, so I'll give you lots of time for your, certainly for your responses. As the chair has mentioned, we have traveled extensively. We've had many witnesses in talking about Canada-U.S. relations. Certainly the piece that perhaps is certainly missing is the cultural piece with Indigenous peoples. Max, you had talked about opportunities. So, I mean, I'm very heartened to hear that more businesses, Indigenous businesses are working abroad than the average Canadian company. Where do you see the opportunities for growth? And maybe you could all just respond to this. Where do you see the challenges? Is there a model agreement that you could see that we could emulate? Is this something that we're starting fresh and we will be the model in terms of that? If you could just maybe start with those.
Absolutely. Sorry, do you want? We're a fairly optimistic organization because I think, representing a lot of businesses, and they're pretty optimistic overall. I think that it's a really interesting environment right now because there are so many really innovative frameworks for success that we've seen across Canada. I think Member 2 in the East and the Atlantic region, I think you see private companies like the Boucher Group of companies partnering with Carillion, which is a major multinational out of the UK, which now owns 48% of the Boucher Group of companies. You see, as I'd said, TransAlta, which did a deal with a regional, local First Nation to have power lines go across their community, and then instead of paying them a small amount of money every year in perpetuity, bundled that money, took it to the bond market, and was able to come back with enough money for the community to buy into an equity position in the project. I think that there's no lack of imagination on the business side, and there's no lack of it's not quite one size fits all because there are similar problems, absolutely, but there's a number of solutions around partnerships and around procurement, around financing. I'd say that a few of the highlights would be to reduce some of the lingering restrictions imposed by the Indian Act on business on reserve. I'd say that ensuring that there is a robust access to procurement policies, as well as support for small businesses to go through those processes, which can be quite complicated. And I'd say an increased support for financing, particularly through AFIs, Aboriginal financial institutions. I think those would be some of the highlights.
Quickly add to that question for
Yes,
Dawn would be looking at women. We've heard from so many witnesses, and I've sat on a couple different committees talking about the economic security of women and the challenges to actually get financing. Is that a similar situation among First Nations? And how do we create a stronger people-to-people opportunity and integrated supply chains?
It was referenced that Aboriginal financial institutions work with Indigenous businesses, and I can tell you that we have a higher rate than any other financial institution in Canada in supporting Indigenous or in supporting women businesses and women entrepreneurs. And I think that that's something that we need more of, the support of that Aboriginal financial institution network to support Indigenous women in the businesses. I also have to say that, just to add to the comments here, is that, when I first came here, I was thinking, well, I could promote that we work primarily in the resource development industries, but we don't. I, every day, finance Indigenous businesses, and they're in every sector, Yes, it was last Thursday, our board met, and we were financing a company that's operating in Canada and the U.S. that builds parking meters for commercial parking lots for hospitals, government buildings, and all. And their business has grown 4 times in 1 year. And they're doing a lot of export. They're doing amazing work there. We have companies, of course, in every sector. And fisheries, I think, is really important to look at in Canada. That's one of the areas that we can provide food security around the world, and we have the resources to do so. And Indigenous people are the first ones involved in that kind of an industry. So there's all kinds of sectors that we can be involved in, and I think more of that should be supported.
Thank you.
We have to look back to look forward. We can't forget about the past. Some people say the past is in the past, but quite frankly, it's not. Look at the reserves. Those were created 100 years ago, and they're still here. And the reserves were designed to economically and politically isolate indigenous peoples. We're still suffering because of that. So what I'm suggesting is a bold move, is to do what the United States has tried to do, to try and create from those reserves tribal trade zones in those reserves, regardless of where they are, isolated, so that there's an economic opportunity for intertribal trade. The Indian Commercial and the Indian Trade and Commercial Act, which unfortunately never got passed, was one of those ideas that was spearheaded, and it's to give a recognition of the fact that we've got these reserves and these people are isolated. How can we help them? Well, we've got to turn this challenge, this problem, into an opportunity. And the opportunity there is to create an economic zone that helps and that gives them, quite frankly, to make right wrong, to give that economic advantage that they've been so desperately deprived of.
Thank you.
Can I just make one more quick point to that? Something that we've been heartened with in the last few months that we've seen in the government is there's something my boss would say if he was here, is that all roads can sometimes lead to INAC, and no matter what the issue is, we always end up back on INAC's desk. And I've been really heartened to see that spreading out a little bit in multiple agriculture, global affairs, and I said a number of different ministries have taken and started to take up work, which we think is a very positive step. And the last thing is that we did I was quoting those figures about Aboriginal companies trading more than the Canadian average and innovating more than the Canadian average. Aboriginal women business leaders actually innovate and trade more than the Aboriginal average or the Canadian average. So,
Well, that wraps up our time, and we're running a little late, but we're sorry we started late. We had some comments on one of our colleagues that passed away in the House, so we got late. But very good dialogue here this afternoon. If you have any more you want to add to our committee, any more thoughts or any more information, we'd appreciate it. I'd appreciate it, Chair, if your counterparts that you're talking about in the United States or Mexico, if we could find out who they are, maybe we can get some information. I think if there's going to be a good deal for North America, it's everybody working together. So the more we know where everybody's at, it'd be good. So I appreciate getting that, or our committee receiving that, and so we can ask the questions too when we're traveling abroad. So thank you again for coming, and this report should wound up around the end of November, and we should be done 1st of December with the report, and we'll get you copies to show you what's in it. So thank you again. We're just going to stop only for a minute here to change to our next panel. So I don't want MPs taking off too far. We're only stopping for a minute. for right now. Can MPs take their seats? Yeah, we got to. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to do it Wednesday. I want to get my, I want to get paid for today. But we're in camera. Okay, let's get going, folks. Who are we waiting for? Miss Ramsey? Sorry. We're going to get started here, but before we get started, Mr. Allison, you have some comments?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mr. Recchi. I just want to state for the committee, I realize we're new here and stuff, and I also know that negotiations are ongoing right now. I would like a chance for the committee to talk, and now is not the time because we have witnesses here to discuss where we're at with the negotiations, possibly bring one of the ministers in. I know Ms. Freeland is busy, but even if it's Mr. Champagne, to give us an update, especially after the next round that's going to be here. So I want to have that discussion. Now is not the time, but we need to find some time on the agenda over the next couple days, over the next couple weeks. I realize you'll be traveling next week to figure out if we can get some updates in here, find out what's going on, whether we need to go on camera, any of these other kinds of things to get a handle of what's going on in this negotiation. Okay?
Well, a good suggestion. I think Wednesday I'm going to leave 15 minutes or so at the end for new business, and we can do that, and maybe we'll make sure the parliamentary secretaries to give a report. And
okay.
So, no, good idea, and we'll do it Wednesday. But without further ado, we're going to continue on with our study. And I welcome the guests here today. Our study, of course, you know, is the future trade agreements that we're going to have in North America with our counterparts. And
What's our study?
well, it's you want me be more specific? It's the study of priorities for Canadian stakeholders having an interest in bilateral, trilateral trade in North America between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So maybe we can use, we can shorten that up. But anyway, that's where we're at, folks. Yeah. Welcome, guests, and many of you have been before us before, so good to see you again. And so you know how we operate. We try to keep the presentations under 5 minutes, and then so we can have lots of dialogue with the MPs. So without further ado, I think we're going to go with the Dairy Farmers of Canada. And congratulations, sir, you're the new president. You represent a lot of cows, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Doing my presentation in French. C'est correct?
C'est bon.
Au nom des producteurs laitiers.
On behalf of Dairy Farmers of Canada, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to present comments to the Standing Committee on International Trade with regard to its study of the North American Free Trade Agreement. I'd like to encourage you to read our brief. There's a lot more information in the brief than what I'll be able to make in my remarks today. I'd like to remind you that the Canadian dairy sector makes a significant contribution to the Canadian economy. We make a $19.9 billion contribution to the GDP, as well as $3.8 billion of revenue each year. And this leads to 221,000 jobs. The producers receive their revenue from the markets and do not receive direct subsidies from the government, completely unlike what occurs in the United States. Even if we concentrate on the domestic market, international negotiations are of great importance for us, as we believe it is important to maintain our supply management system, which is described in the brief. In the original NAFTA, the Canadian dairy sector was set aside by the Canadian government. We believe that that must continue to be the case. Our sector must be kept out of the negotiations. We do not have anything against these negotiations as long as there is not a negative impact on the dairy farmers of Canada. Making changes to the benefit of U.S. dairy farmers would be harmful to the Canadian economy, as it would decrease our GDP and create job loss, particularly in rural regions, as well as a decrease in revenue for producers, and would lead to no advantage for Canada. As has been stated numerous times, trade between Canada and the United States, well, there's a significant trade surplus for the states, more than 400 million Canadian dollars. More than 10% of Canadian demand is already met by imported dairy supply, some of which comes in the form of dumping from the Americans. In comparison, in the United States, only 3 to 4% of domestic demand is satisfied by imports from any country. So it is not true to say that the Canadian market is closed. Not only does Canada respect its international commitments, it also allows highly subsidized U.S. products to enter the Canadian market and to compete with our domestic production. The support given to U.S. production through direct and indirect government subsidies means that we're not in a fair state of play. And that situation is not going to change soon. Thus, when renegotiating NAFTA, we need to ensure that we create a fairer playing field between Canada and the United States. Moreover, the United States limit their imports of dairy products by using tariff rate quotas, which makes their dairy sector as much or more protectionist than Canada's. For example, there are 24 tariff rate quotas for dairy products in the States and only 12 in Canada. Moreover, we should not forget that protectionist policies are in place in some industries in the United States, some sensitive industries, such as sugar and the dairy sector. And in many cases, these policies are more strict than Canada's. And finally, I'd like to talk about compliance with the rules. Some have said that Canada has not complied with rules since it has adopted policies that protect trade too much. We believe that the Canadian dairy sector is dynamic and flexible, constantly reacting to changes on the domestic market. Any new policies are created in reaction to these changes. Producers and processors, including producers in Class 7, are not an exception to this rule. In fact, we instead favor innovation, which will allow us to grow the Canadian dairy industry. The strategy's objective is to update our capacity to produce a range of products, both food and non-food products, to simplify our supply chain and to increase our flexibility to respond to demand more efficiently, while adding value to Canadian protein products. Once again, the Canadian sector is focusing on the needs of the domestic markets and is not focusing on exports like the American industry. More than once, the American sector has found loopholes in its trade with Canada in order to benefit. For example, the United States has created a product that they use very rarely, diafiltered milk, in order to profit from a loophole in existing trade agreements, and in order to be able to set lower prices than Canadian products have, which leads to losses of approximately $230 million annually for Canadian producers since 2015. Because of these imports of diafiltered milk, which directly replace Canadian milk products. Other examples that you'll see in the document: the Canadian industry has always respected and will continue to respect international trade agreements. But one cannot say the same for the American dairy industry. In conclusion, I'd like to say that I and other representatives of DFC are participating in negotiations at each round, and I believe that so far the government is handling the negotiations well and is keeping stakeholders informed, and we will keep an eagle eye out for developments. Thank you.
We're going to move on now to the Food and Beverages of Ontario. And we've got Mr. Peel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good afternoon, committee members, and thank you for inviting us to speak to the NAFTA priorities of Food and Beverage Ontario. Food and Beverage Ontario represents a critical sector in the national economy. The Ontario food and beverage processing sector is one of the largest in North America, representing over 3,800 provincial food processing businesses that generate $42 billion in revenue and exported $6.9 billion food goods last year. I will refer you to our written submission for more details on the sector and the magnitude of our economic impact. Our members are concerned about these negotiations because there's so much at stake for them. Over 3/4 of Ontario's agri-food exports are sold to the United States. Much of the reason for this trade dependency is location. As part of the vital Great Lakes regional trading hub, our companies are within one-day shipping radius of some 142 million consumers. That is a market pull that simply cannot be ignored. Further, the interests of my members are somewhat unique. The products that food processors deal in tend to be seasonal or cyclical or perishable or all three. In this respect, food goods are distinct from widgets, and just-in-time delivery has greater import when considering food goods with an infinite shelf life. It is not only contract fulfillment that is at stake if timely delivery is not accomplished, but often the very value of the shipment itself. Supply chain integration has been one of the key and enduring successes of NAFTA. The high level of integrated business operations established under the NAFTA underlines the strong competitive position of Ontario's food and beverage sector. The food distribution chains that stretch across the continent are the reason that industry can meet consumer demand for a consistent supply of fresh, healthy, affordable food goods. Let me reemphasize the point. These goods tend to be seasonal or cyclical or perishable or all three. So trade, particularly the unfettered movement of goods, services, and people between Canada and the United States, is critical to the ongoing success and competitiveness of the sector. And border infrastructure, like the Ambassador, Blue Water, Peace, Lewiston, Queenston bridges, are the sector's lifelines. I'm pleased to tell you that FBO is not alone in viewing that NAFTA is critical, and that this view is not distinctly Canadian. I had the privilege to participate with Ontario Agriculture Minister Jeff Veal in an ambitious U.S. advocacy tour that took us to Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York State, Illinois, Missouri earlier this spring. We met with U.S. state government and business representatives, and I was struck by the commonality and interests we share when it comes to NAFTA renegotiation. The common thread in our discussions was that reopening the NAFTA should do no harm. The NAFTA has largely benefited food and beverage processing sector on both sides of the border. Any new provisions in the NAFTA 2.0 that undermines the current level of market access and supply chain integration would be detrimental to our industry and ultimately to consumers across North America. Sure, there's a room and opportunity for improvement. In modernizing the NAFTA, it is hoped that there will be further streamlining of border crossings and further reductions in administrative burdens that allow for timely, efficient border processes. In other words, this is an opportunity to reduce the cost and the burdens of doing cross-border business, an opportunity to thin the border, if you will. NAFTA 2.0 should be about simplifying customs procedures by reducing document and certification requirements, expanding the use of electronic filing, ensuring timely border inspections and release of goods, and allowing for expedited customs treatment of low-risk shipments. Regulatory disconnects still occur around food safety and non-food safety issues. These need to be minimized. To accomplish this work, the work of the U.S.-Canada Regulatory Cooperation Council should be expanded and made permanent. In addition, NAFTA modernization may be an occasion to take regulatory cooperation a step further and entertain establishing a joint Canada-U.S. authority to oversee food safety risk assessments, a joint bilateral office that would ensure stronger linkages between existing Canadian and U.S. authorities to allow for regulatory alignment on the following: science-based food safety risk assessments using common data, hazard identification and characterization, exposure assessments, and risk characterization, best practices in food safety, risk management along the farm-to-fork continuum, and collecting, analyzing, and communicating food safety knowledge for the benefit of consumers, government agencies, food producers, exporters, and importers. NAFTA 2.0 represents an opportunity to enhance public protections, cross-border business competitiveness, and efficiencies in regulatory program delivery. In addition to the above, it is important that these negotiations reach a timely conclusion, and that governments offer sufficient transparency in the negotiating process to keep stakeholder groups well informed regarding the process. The uncertainty and unpredictability regarding the breadth and length of NAFTA negotiations has already cast a chill on future business investment. And finally, once a revised version of NAFTA is reached, governments must ensure a seamless transition to any changes in the agreement. Businesses will require sufficient lead time to understand, adapt, and modify as necessary established processes and supply chain relationships to achieve and ensure compliance. Thank you again for the opportunity to present to this committee, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Beale. And your group, you of course represent Ontario, but I think you have a national group too that speaks very similar to what you're saying.
Absolutely. I'm the vice chair of an organization called Food and Beverage Canada, and we also have a member of understanding with my Quebec counterparts. So I'm speaking for
that's right. I gotta let the committee know that what you're saying is not just for Ontario. It's for the country from your industry's perspective.
And remember that Ontario and Quebec alone represent 65% of the food processing.
Thank you, sir. And we're going to move on to Mr. Geisten. He's no stranger to our committee, and it's good to see you back. And go ahead, sir. You got the floor.
Great. Good to be back. Good afternoon. From speaking for the country to speaking for myself. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where I hold the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law. As always, I appear in a personal capacity representing only my own views. There's much to say about NAFTA, and I've written a lot of articles and posts on the agreement, but I have limited time, so I thought I'd focus really on two issues, primarily the intellectual property chapter, and then a couple of comments on the e-commerce chapter. While Canada is accustomed to playing defense when it comes to U.S. intellectual property demands in trade talks, this round of renegotiation offers the chance to proactively ensure that Canadian IP priorities and policies are reflected in the agreement. Now, to put the IP issue in context, over the past 5 years, Canada has implemented anti-circumvention laws, the digital lock rules, similar to those found in the United States, added stronger enforcement measures, enacted anti-counterfeiting legislation, extended the term of protection for sound recordings, and engaged in patent and trademark reforms. It should be recognized that Canada already meets its international IP obligations and has largely addressed previous U.S. demands regarding further reforms. At a broad level, the Canadian negotiating goal should be to retain an appropriate IP balance that fosters creativity and access while ensuring that there is room for Canadian-specific policies that sit within the flexibilities of the international IP framework. Now, what might that look like? I'd like to raise 5 points. First, Canada should insist on the inclusion of language on maintaining balance across all IP rights, the legitimate interests of users, promoting access to and preserving the public domain, ensuring IP rights do not create barriers to legitimate trade, and facilitating access to affordable medicines. Similar language was raised during the negotiations of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and belongs in NAFTA. Secondly, the availability of the fair use provision in the United States represents a significant competitive advantage for U.S. businesses and creators. To ensure a level playing field for innovation and creativity, the NAFTA IP chapter should require that all parties feature a fair use or fair use equivalent provision. Third, Canadian copyright laws' anti-circumvention provisions are amongst the most restrictive in the world and badly undermine the copyright balance in the digital world, which may create unnecessary restrictions for innovation. While the Canadian exceptions were narrowly constructed and limited just to a handful of circumstances, the United States has actually been expanding its digital lock exceptions. That imbalance creates another uneven playing field for innovation and should be remedied within NAFTA. Fourth, the Canadian IP chapter should also address the abuse of intellectual property rights that may inhibit companies from innovating or discourage Canadians from taking advantage of the digital market. The advantage of anti-IP abuse provisions could be used to touch on patents, trademarks, and copyright, and I'd be happy to spell out why. Fifth, one of the chief concerns with past trade negotiations is the expectation that the United States requires other countries to mirror its IP laws, even if those laws extend beyond international law requirements. The Canadian approach should be to require NAFTA parties to meet international law, but retain the full flexibility that is found within those laws. I'll give you an example. The term of copyright in Canada is presently life of the author plus an additional 50 years. A term that is compliant with the international standards set by the Berne Convention. The United States is expected to pressure us to increase that term from life plus 50 to an additional life plus 70, 20 more years. Now, I recently conducted research on the role of copyright term in the public domain in Canadian schools using data obtained by the Ontario Book Publishers Organization. According to data submitted by hundreds of school teachers and school districts in Ontario, half of the most popular books taught in grades 7 through 12 are in the public domain or about to enter into it. If we extend the term of copyright as the U.S. seeks, dozens of books used by thousands of students today that are scheduled to enter into the public domain would be shut out for decades. The prospect of using those books in new and innovative ways without the need for further licensing or royalties, as well as increasing access in open electronic form, and we're seeing a lot of that open education emphasis, would be lost for a generation. These are crucial IP issues that I don't think should be overlooked. And I know my time is limited, so I'll just quickly reference the e-commerce chapter, but I'd be happy to address more in questions. I'd note that Canada should be wary of including provisions that undermine legitimate public policy interests in the e-commerce chapter, particularly privacy and security. The United States has identified restrictions against local data storage mandates, often called data localization, as one of its objectives. I believe the Canadian government should resist efforts within NAFTA to limit the ability for both federal or provincial governments to establish legitimate privacy and security safeguards through data localization requirements, and we already have a couple of provinces in Canada that do just that. Finally, limitations on data transfer restrictions, which mandate the free flow of information on networks across borders, can raise similar concerns. While the U.S. is seeking a ban on data transfer restrictions, Canada should ensure that privacy and security laws will not be superseded by NAFTA restrictions. In fact, I would argue that throughout the e-commerce chapter, Canada should be seeking higher-level privacy protections and e-commerce regulations similar to those found within our own country. I'd welcome your questions.
Well, thank you, sir. And we're going to start with the dialogue with the MPs. And it looks like we have time for one full round here. And we're going to start off with the Conservatives. Mr. Allison, you got the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to our witnesses. Since I only have 5 minutes and there's hardly enough time to get started on anything, I can't ask you all questions, but I'm going to go to you, Mr. Beale. What keeps you awake at night when we look at the negotiation in terms of what the U.S. has stated in their document to say, you know, this is our our negotiations and where our starting point is. What is your concern, or what are some of your concerns as it relates to your industry in terms of what they're looking to try and do?
Well, thank you for that question. It seems to change almost every day, but certainly Chapter 19, the dispute resolution clause, is critical importance, I think, to the long-term validity of NAFTA. That is a major concern of all food processors across the country. But the key here is, and then like I mentioned in my submission, is that you know, I spent a month on the road with Minister Leal, and we went down and met with 13 secretaries of agriculture from 13 different states, met with many, many business leaders, and the supply chain integration in our industry is extremely important. And as a matter of fact, is the Canadian Dairy Council has alluded to, is that most of those states run in surpluses to Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, Manitoba, and so those states are running surplus. So they're at actually higher risk if we start thickening that border and we start impacting the supply, the integrated supply chain. Minister Yeo used to talk about his wife's Dodge Caravan and how it was assembled in Windsor, but it crossed the border 8 times before, by the time it was assembled. That is exactly the true of the food and beverage processing industry as well. We visited Blommer Chocolates down in, which is one of the largest raw chocolate processors in North America. And as we were pulling into the parking lot of the plant, there were 7 transport trucks with Ontario plates on them, going up to the Campbellville plant to be further processed and then shipped back down to the United States for further processing, whether it's going into chocolate milk or going into chocolate bars, that sort of thing. So that integration is critically important. So anything that creates a slowing down or thickening that border will have a massive impact on the competitiveness of our industry. So, but that, and of course, dispute resolution is critical as well. But like I say, tomorrow I'll wake up and there'll be something else that was twittered out that we'll be concerned about.
Thank you. That's 2.5 minutes, and I know that we, I know my colleague wants to answer questions, so I'm going to go to Mr. Dreeshen for at least one. So. Go ahead. Mr. Dreeshen.
Well, thank you very much, and certainly an honor to be here and to be able to speak with you folks. Be no surprise that perhaps I'd want to talk about the Canadian dairy sector, and I've been on Ag Committee for a number of years, and we were actually just, when I was in industry, we'd just been down to the U.S. and talked to various senators and New York senators, and then talking about dairy and the issues that are taking place there. And of course, one of the things that they mentioned is just a simple technical thing, simply going from milking 2 times a day to 3 times a day, increasing the volume by 15%, and then wondering why the price is going to go down because of the extra milk that is in the system. And then, of course, after that, having the ability to take the milk solids and split them, and then moving them into Canada, so they perhaps wonder why it is that we got a little testy in that particular area. But I'm wondering if you can expand upon that, because there are so many, and you mentioned it somewhat in your discussions, Mr. Lampron, and that is, there's a lot of U.S. subsidies out there as well. And so when we talk about what is taking place, that seldom comes up on the table. So if you can expand a little bit about some of the issues that you see as far as the dairy industry is concerned, and the issues that keep getting thrown at us in the discussions, and then talk about what the U.S. subsidies are specifically in the dairy, but obviously with your other sources, you would no doubt know what some of the other subsidies is for other commodities.
Well, agricultural production has to do with food sovereignty. Each country wants to protect its own agricultural sector. In Canada, with the supply management sector, we decided that was the best system, which protects our borders and guarantees revenue from the markets for producers. But the Americans have a different system. They have a free market that follows world prices, but the Farm Bill supports producers because otherwise they couldn't get by. So we here in Canada have the supply management system, and the Americans have their own system. Maybe we need the same system to be able to trade with them. And we need to have our strong borders in order to continue to have our own supply management system. That's why I mentioned the dye-filtered milk issue. This new dye-filtered milk method didn't exist when the first agreements were made, so that's why that they've created it to be able to sell it over the border and push aside Canadian products. Isabelle, do you have something to add?
We are working very closely right now with the negotiating team, the Canadian negotiating team, and as you probably know, we have a study that we are updating on all the Americans' subsidies for the dairy industry. For example, we're not calculating that, but because we cannot put numbers on that, but you have seen reports that most of the dairy workers in dairy farms in the U.S. are illegal immigrants. That cannot be quantified. But what we know from the dairy farmers themselves and the American Dairy Farmers Association is that if those workers were to be legal and therefore declare in their income, the price of milk in the U.S. would go up by more than 50%. So those are kind of examples. Of course, like I said, we are working very closely with the negotiators so that the negotiators can actually at some point use that study. So therefore, we are waiting in order to make it public so that Canada can use it before we can make it public.
Well, thank you very much. Good question. And we're going to move over to the Liberals. And Madame Lapointe, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais saluer mes nouveaux collègues.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome my new colleagues on the committee. I'd also like to thank the witnesses. And it's very nice to have a witness who really wants to talk French. I'm the only Francophone on the committee, so that's really nice for me. You mentioned the workforce and how different it is in the United States, that there are many illegal workers, if I may use that term. What are the differences between the Canadian and American systems of production? You mentioned the workforce, but there are also hormones. What is the impact of that on trade? Please let me know what you think about that, and then I have other questions. Well, certain hormones are not allowed in Canada, so when we compare prices, we also need to consider the fact that there's milk without somatotropin in Canada and compare that with the milk that does have that hormone in the States. Then there's also climate. After all, this is a northern country. American farms are much larger, especially in some states. It's more big industry than in Canada, where we have more family farms with about 78 average cows per farm. Now, when it comes to the workforce, you said that there are various studies on the market. But can you give us numbers? Can you give us an idea of how many workers are not in the statistics? Or, well, we just don't have those precise statistics. Because these workers are illegal, it's very hard to tot them up for that very reason. Now, you discussed the United States market, but what about Mexico? Are there any issues with Mexico? Not really? Okay. Well, I'd just like to interject on Mexico. In the media over the last few weeks, you've seen that Mexican dairy producers have come out in support of American producers. But that's because there's a lot of pressure on them to support the Americans, because they're getting a lot of pressure from the Americans because they work together a lot. And there's no pressure on the Mexicans to come out in favor of the Canadian market. Now I have a question on e-commerce. Last week, Pam Goldsmith-Jones, our parliamentary secretary, came to meet with some businesses in my riding to speak about free trade. And two groups met with her, and they both stated that they were concerned about e-commerce. You didn't mention it earlier too much, but you did mention high security standards, which are important. But if you were going to prepare a new chapter, because this didn't exist 24 years ago, what would you like to add?
Well, it will be new to NAFTA. It's unlikely to be new to Canada and the United States. And so I think the expectation is that the blueprint that is being used is the e-commerce chapter that was included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TPP. And so we have a pretty good sense of the kinds of issues that are out there. In fact, U.S. officials have highlighted the e-commerce chapter as one of their priorities. They see updating NAFTA to include some of these digital issues. And to the extent to which they're representing, let's say, large Silicon Valley companies that have set up very large cloud-based servers, they want to ensure that data flows freely to the United States and can be actively stored in the United States. Now, one of the things that we have seen take place over the last number of years, especially as people become more aware of some of the privacy implications and surveillance activities that take place around the world, more and more Canadians, more and more Europeans in Europe and in other jurisdictions are anxious to ensure that their data resides locally within the country and that it is subject to their own local or national laws. And in fact, both British Columbia and Nova Scotia have set up for certain kinds of information laws that require that information be stored within the province. In fact, the EU, as you may know, has become increasingly aggressive about limiting disclosure across borders outside the EU unless the country has strong privacy protections. The danger that we face is really twofold here. One, the prospect that that chapter might limit our ability to say we want to ensure, at least in certain circumstances, that Canadians' information is subject to Canadian privacy law and may be required to be retained locally in some circumstances. And also, we run the risk that if there is this data transfer provision that says you can't put up any restrictions on transferring between borders, we could on the one hand have NAFTA say no restrictions, and the EU on the other hand say if you want to continue to transfer data between Canada and the EU member states, you must have some restrictions because you can't allow that same data to, let's say, leak down to the United States. That puts us between the proverbial rock and a hard place where we get one major trading bloc saying no restrictions and another saying you've got to have some restrictions in order to trade.
Et par rapport au Mexique, vous me parlez des États-Unis puis du Canada.
Now, with regard to Mexico, Do you have any concerns about Mexico?
Well, Mexico is on these kinds of issues, on IP and on e-commerce, hasn't been particularly aggressive when it comes to their own interests. They've, I think, tended to prioritize some of the other issues. It has tended to be the United States that prioritizes both the intellectual property chapter as well as the e-commerce chapter. And from a Canadian perspective, I'd argue that over the last decade, we've really crafted some of our own, in a sense, made-in-Canada solutions when it comes to both intellectual property as well as e-commerce within that international framework that I've talked about, and that it would be, I think it's important to ensure that those kinds of Canadian policies and priorities that we've worked quite hard to ensure reflect Canadian values also get reflected within NAFTA.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. And before I go to the NDP, I have a question for you, Mr. Geis. And you mentioned the e-commerce chapter, and and we talked TPP, and now we're dealing with the NAFTA, but was there a chapter with the European Union? It must have been, and was it fairly robust, or was it fairly modern? And can't we be using some of that language in this agreement with NAFTA?
No, there's no equivalent e-commerce chapter in the CETA, in the Canada-EU trade agreement. So given that the TPP, at least for the moment, is either sidelined completely or likely to be renegotiated and through TPP 11, NAFTA would represent really the first time that Canada had agreed to some of those provisions. And I think it's worth noting that from a U.S. perspective, the TPP e-commerce chapter really reflected what they wanted to see happen. They are anxious to see that implemented in some agreement, and in a sense, we're at the very front of the line given where NAFTA stands amongst their trade talks.
Thank you for that clarification. And we're going to move over to the NDP now. And Ms. Ramsey, you've got the floor for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. This is tough. There are certainly good questions for all of you. Thank you so much. I'll go to the dairy farmers first. We hear you clearly that you must be kept out of NAFTA, and I can assure you that from the NDP side of the House, we'll be defending that and your interests going forward. And we also, see what happened in CETA, just happened, where there was compensation that was promised after 1 week that is completely closed to farmers. So any opportunity that they would have had for those funds to offset CETA is gone. I do not want to see the same thing happen in NAFTA, where we give up a portion and then promise something and then are unable to follow through, and farmers again are hurt. I represent a rural riding, and so I do have a passion. I have dairy farmers in my riding, and I've heard clearly from them how concerned they are about NAFTA. So I want to ask you if you can just share with us what you expect in this next round that's starting on Saturday here in Canada.
C'est sûr que la position, c'est toujours la même.
It's clear that we always have the same position. The government's position is not to have an impact on Canadian dairy producers, and that is what we expect. Of course, we are getting a lot of pressure with the Americans, with Trump, who's saying all sorts of things. But ultimately, we haven't really heard what he wants from the Canadian market. But our defensive position is not to give them more access to markets. We've got to remember that Canada, compared to the States, well, there are states who want more access to the Canadian market, but mainly we have a trade deficit with regard to the States. Isabelle, do you have something to add?
It was announced, if you remember, that the government at the time had said, well, prove us that you are losing something and we might consider compensation. During the TPP negotiation, it became clear to the Canadian government that the dairy farmers were actually having negative impact from trade deals. So when the compensation package for TPP was announced, there was a portion for CETA. So we were very pleased by that recognition. And then the compensation for CETA was announced. And then now it is being put in place, if I can say. The first phase actually took place very fast and closed very fast because obviously the farmers are very interested, but it was the first phase. And so there will be other opportunities because the $250 million has been divided, and so there will be other opportunities. And government acknowledged that the first phase was not a real success, and so we're working with them right now with Agriculture Canada and Mr. McCauley's office to correct the imperfection for the second phase, and so the farmers don't go through the same thing. So we think now that the Canadian government realizes that whenever they give access, there is impact on the farmers. So for Dairy Farmers of Canada, the important thing for government is no negative impact.
Yes.
On dairy farmers.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Geist, there's so many things we could go through. I wonder if you can touch on the notice and notice versus notice and takedown and the impact, because there was a reference to this in the 18-page document that we saw from the U.S. about their priorities, but it wasn't mentioned from the Canadian government on our priorities. So can you talk about that and how exactly we can, protect our digital copyright regulations?
Sure. So what you're referencing is the system that was established in 2012 that actually had been in place in Canada for quite a number of years on an informal basis, where there is an allegation of infringement, rights holders have the ability to send a notification on to an internet provider who is then obligated to forward that notification along to their subscriber. They don't disclose their personal information, so their privacy is protected. And at least in concept, it was seen as really an excellent way both to educate the public on copyright and when infringements take place and preserve their privacy, as well as to encourage new business models to emerge. The U.S. has adopted a different approach known as notice and takedown. The problem with that is that actually creates the system where millions of pieces of works may be taken down with no judicial oversight whatsoever. And so sometimes described as a shoot first and aim later approach, where there are many, many allegations of infringement, content comes down, nobody does any sort of oversight at all. The incentive is simply to remove it without any of that oversight. The U.S. has pressured us in the past to try to adopt that. As part of the TPP, the Canadian government actually was anxious to ensure that notice and notice was preserved. We haven't seen the government make that same point of emphasis yet, although I think we're hopeful that they will continue with the notice and notice approach, although I should note that notice and notice itself has been subject to some real problems. As it's been subject to widespread abuse, you may have heard from some of your own constituents who received these notifications because rights holders have been using them to send along demands to settle. And that was never envisioned as part of the system. In fact, I did a piece just last week that noted the minister that I said, Navdeep Bains, Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development, Navdeep Bains, was notified in a memo as much as a year ago that this was not the intent, that this widespread abuse is taking place. There is an easy fix for it, and I would argue that the sooner we can get that fixed in Canada through regulation so that there is not that kind of misuse, the sooner we're in a position not only to preserve a good system, but to make the case to the United States that, if anything, they ought to think about adopting notice and notice as a more effective and balanced approach to dealing with allegations of infringement.
I've had constituents caught in that fraud and paid money to bodies that are demanding it from them, and they had no legal they couldn't enforce them to legally do that, but people get that notice, they get afraid. It's a lot of times seniors, maybe their kids or grandkids have been on their laptop or on their iPad, and all of a sudden they're being sent this, and so they just go and pay it. And so it is a real concern for people who are being, having fraud committed on them.
Yeah, that is precisely what happens, and it's a bit difficult to understand why, given that we've had this in place for 2 years, and this can be easily remedied through regulation, that nothing has happened to date.
Thank you, sir. And we're going to go to the last slot. Last MP is Mr. Peterson. You got the floor for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this afternoon on our first day back in this session. And just before I start, I want to welcome our new members from across the table here and pay a little quick tribute to Mr. Ritz, who not only left the committee but actually has left the House, and we wish him well in his future endeavors. He was always a vociferous advocate of the positions he held, but we appreciated his contribution to the committee, and it was I speak for myself, but perhaps everyone on the committee, that it was a pleasure to work with him for the 2 years almost that we worked with him, and I expect just the same vigor from our three new members that Mr. Ritz provided. Back to the sort of substance at hand here. I just want to follow up Professor Geist a little bit on the notice period, and just, I know there's a merit to both systems. Each country sort of has their interest they're wanting to protect. In an ideal world, how would you see a system working that would protect the interest but also allow for some fair use, and without, subject to fraud, and actually be a viable system in place that would kind of reach all the goals that it ought to reach?
I've been banging the table to let someone let me write the Copyright Act for a long time. So
Here's your chance. This will be draft one.
Right. So thanks for that. On the issue of enforcement, ensuring that rights holders have the effective tools to ensure that their rights are respected, I actually think the government in 2012 did a good job of that. We have, for example, an enabler provision that allows rights holders to go after sites that enable infringement, foster that infringement. It's not widely found elsewhere. And frankly, notice and notice, if implemented appropriately, I think represents a best of breed. A number of other countries have taken a look at it. One place where we fall short is on the issue of fair use. And if you take a look at a lot of the innovation that you see taking place, many of those U.S.-based companies, many of the U.S. creators rely on fair use. We have in Canada a fair dealing provision that has admittedly been interpreted in a broad manner, but is not as flexible as that fair use provision. And to the extent to which part of what we're trying to achieve in NAFTA is a level playing field so that Canadian businesses and creators can innovate in the same fashion as their counterparts in the United States, ensuring that we've got that fair use approach is, I think, clearly one way to try to do that. In fact, it's worth noting that some of the most innovative economies around the world, thinking of countries like South Korea and Singapore and Israel, have in recent years adopted fair use precisely because they see those kinds of advantages. We run the risk of falling behind if we don't have it. NAFTA is an ideal mechanism to try to ensure that it gets implemented.
Thank you for that elaboration. And just I was going to follow up to, we talk about, I think the phrase they use is the legitimate interest of users when we talk about balancing the fair use and that. How would we determine that legitimate interest, and ought that be part of a trade deal, or is there other ways to do that, or is it through regulations, or what do you think the best approach to that is?
Well, we often talk about user rights, which is I think that reference, and the Supreme Court of Canada has often talked about creator rights on the one hand, user rights on the other. We've done a pretty good job, I think, through the courts and then through the legislation itself about trying to articulate that kind of balance. And you read about court cases sometimes that go in one direction, sometimes go in another. And so I think we've got the sense of how you try to strike that balance a little bit through the courts. I'm not sure that that's the sort of thing that you'd want to see in NAFTA, except to the extent to which you want to make it clear that striking a balance is a core part of what it means to have an intellectual property chapter. It's why there was discussion of having that included within the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and why I think it's the sort of thing we need within NAFTA to ensure that all countries, including Mexico, of course, recognize that part of creating a modern, flexible, innovative IP system is respecting both creator rights and user rights. In other words, trying to ensure there's an appropriate balance.
Thank you for that. How much time have I left, Mr. Chair?
Another minute.
Okay. I want to focus on to our food and beverage witness here. I know I'm a fan of both food and beverage, so it's nice to have you here. Thank you for being with us. But I think NAFTA, it's fair to say, as it stands now, is probably serving interest of your organization fairly well.
Absolutely, yeah, food processors.
Are you kind of striving for a status quo, and that would be great, or is there improvements you'd like to see, and if so, what would they be?
No, clearly what we would like to see, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is we'd actually like to see a continued thinning of the border, and we'd like to see cooperation, particularly on food safety regulatory measures and things like that, streamlined. Right now, you can have food held up. As I mentioned, the food is generally speaking is perishable, and you can find some overzealous border agents basically slowing down that transfer of goods across the border to the point where food is spoiled. There's real no need for that, and sometimes it's a direct reflection of really trying to thicken the border and trade protectionism. So we see there's a real opportunity through the Trade Cooperation Council and actually another body at a higher level that really drills down into some of the food safety assessment mechanisms and things like that, where we can sit down with our U.S. counterparts and agree on all these top-line items, particularly on low-risk food safety issues, where it's streamlined and it's an automatic, and that would improve, by the way, transfer goods on both sides of the border. So I think that's a real important opportunity in NAFTA is to see that whole regulatory process streamlined.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, that wraps it up here.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
And that wraps up our afternoon, and I really thank the witnesses for coming. Just this panel alone shows how diverse the trade, how it impacts every citizen in this country, and from various ways. And we really appreciate you coming. And and we're going to be presenting our report before December, so we'll give you a copy. So thank you very much again, and before I adjourn the meeting, I just got to remind all MPs, it's a very heavy workload we got Wednesday. We're going 3 hours. We got 9 witnesses, so we're going to have future business, so be here on time, and let's get our sleeves rolled up and we can get her done. So that adjourns the meeting for today.